Okay, ready to get started? Let's get going. Today's lecture is on design patterns for service systems. This is a really important topic because one thing that happens when you start designing is that at first everything you do looks like a one of a kind. The first time it's ever been done, it's a really challenging task because you've never done it before. But over time, you learn that a lot of things have repeatable elements in your solutions, and there's ways that things fit together that you can use over and over again in your service system design. So what I'm going to talk about today is to kind of help you jumpstart that process of seeing repeatable patterns in designing service systems. Now this is, again, not a new idea. There have been many efforts to devise these kinds of pattern framework that describe families of related business models or related service systems. Many of these are centered around use of information technology, communication technology, to enable new ways for businesses to work together. But taken together, the idea of patterns lets us design our service systems and interactions with services in the same rigorous way that we would do it if we were designing a physical system with machines and that kind of thing, where we can better appreciate the trade-offs we have to make, better find ways to innovate, because you have a more comprehensive sense of the space of possible designs. So I'm going to review 4 design patterns for service systems. They actually overlap in some significant ways, but that means there are 4 different ways of looking at sort of the same problem, and we hope that both individually and collectively they'll give you some kind of shortcut to getting some experience of seeing the range of designs you could apply and being better able to make the choices and trade-offs you need to make in any particular situation. So the 4 patterns are the front stage, backstage pattern, with the front stage, backstage separated by what's called the line of visibility. We have the pattern of where technology fits in the front stage. There's a continuum from person-to-person interactions that have no technology to complete self-service interactions where the service provider has been replaced by technology completely. We have a pattern, the service intensity pattern, which looks at a service system in terms of the number of places that a service provider and service customer come together where value could be created. And these touch points could range from a very large number to a very small number around some generic pattern or sort of average pattern of intensity for that kind of service system. And finally, the most abstract and I believe the most powerful pattern is one that looks at value creation as a mixture of 3 kinds of interactions: interactions with information exchange or symbolic interactions, interactions between people or interpersonal interactions, or interactions with physical things, sort of physical interaction where we engage with some tangible resource to create value. The front stage, backstage pattern is really easy to see because it characterizes a large number of service systems. It emerged in work by James Tabul a while ago in an analysis of seeing that when you analyze the encounter between a service provider and customer, there's often a very sharp line between the things you can see and the things that you can't see that were necessary to make that front stage interaction possible. So we want to contrast the front stage where the activities and interactions that take place that you see, that's where the interactions that you personally engage in as a customer take place. And then the backstage is where all the information and stuff needed to make that front stage possible take place. And then we decide where to put the line of visibility as a design parameter. How many of that backstage services do we end up putting into the front stage so that the customers can see them? And you say, what does that mean, see the interaction? Well, think of something as simple as going to McDonald's. In McDonald's, it's a restaurant with a very small front stage. So you go to the counter and you say, I'd like to have burger and fries, and they may already have them wrapped and ready to go for you. They're already cooked, and you just put them in the bags, and you're out in no time. There's a very limited repertoire of interactions in McDonald's. Very stereotyped kind of questions and answers you can ask of the people at the counter. Because all the work is done in the backstage. That's where the fries are prepared, that's where the hamburgers are grilled, that's where the patties are dressed, and that's where the things are wrapped up, and then you handed the wrapped burger across the counter. So there's a very small front stage in that kind of restaurant experience. At the other extreme, we have restaurants where there's a very large front stage. Things which might be normally done in the back room, the kitchen, are done in front of the customer as part of the restaurant experience. So many of you have probably been to these kind of, I won't say theatrical restaurants like Benihana, where part of the experience of going to the restaurant is to have the chef come out to your table and chop up all the vegetables and throw them on the wok or on the grill and cook in front of you. Which in effect is saying what normally would have taken place in the kitchen is now in front of you, in the front stage. So this kind of line of visibility has moved way to the back, and more of what would have normally been preparation is now visible to the customer. Okay, this is a very common pattern. Consider what's going on right now. You have an experience right now where I am lecturing from notes I prepared a while ago, not in front of you. So you have a very small front stage relative to some kind of experiences in education you might have. Consider the alternative of coming to my office and talking with me about service design patterns. We would be working together to design the information exchange that you're going to get. So a lot of that preparation, which is now hidden from you in my lecture here, would be visible to you if we had moved the line of visibility back to my office in Berkeley, where I was writing these lectures. So you see this kind of contrast between front stage and backstage design, where a front stage perspective is often one that says, let's give the customer maximum usability, maximum flexibility, maximum enjoyment, maybe maximum customization, flexibility, where we can give everybody their own special experience. And this is where people who worry about user interface design, user experience design, or ethnographic kinds of studies like to apply their trade. In contrast, the backstage design problem is often one about operational efficiency or productivity, where the engineers, the computer scientists are trying to write very efficient code or very efficient operations to optimize the way that the food is prepared and so on, to do a lot of planning up front to make it easy to make the meals in the restaurant and so on. And this is much more about process modeling and industrial engineering and kind of scalable development and design. So very different design goals here. And again, might require very different kinds of people in your service design effort. Well, that's the front stage, backstage pattern. The second design pattern I'm going to talk about today is a kind of specialization of the front stage, backstage pattern, looking more closely at the front stage and how technology can be used to enhance the service provided by the service provider to the customer. We can distinguish on the continuum here three varieties or flavors of technology enhancement, depending on whether the provider has the technology, whether the customer has the technology, or whether they have it together in some facilitated way. The first case of the assisted encounter is one where the technology is used by the frontline provider. The service person has the technology and the customer doesn't. So, simple case, if you have a restaurant, the service provider in the restaurant undoubtedly uses the calculator or a computer of some kind, maybe the cash register does it, the assistant that takes the orders, to generate the bill. So the calculation is done by the service provider, and the customer doesn't have any access or input to that process. Alternatively, you could have a service provided where they work together to come up with the service. And so here you have, for example, a case if you go visit an architect, to have the architect work with you to design a home. You might use jointly some kind of CAD program, 3D modeling program, to experiment with a couple of different layouts of windows or doors or floors or ceiling heights and see how that changes the design of your home. So there you're working together with the service provider to enhance the service being delivered or co-created. And finally, you have situations where the customer has technology that the service provider does not have. Favorite example I saw not long ago was at a fancy restaurant, and the wine guy, I guess he's called the sommelier, was talking to a customer and trying to make a wine recommendation, and said something about how this particular wine was the highest rated wine for some particular wine region. And the sommelier walked away, and I looked over at the next table, and the person whipped out a smartphone and started looking at some kind of wine app to check whether the sommelier's recommendation was accurate. And then when the sommelier came back, he says, "You're wrong, it wasn't the highest rated one, this was the highest rated one, I'll have that one instead." So here you see the technology being introduced by the customer, and this provider is kind of taken by surprise that didn't know there was a kind of customer improvisation using technology in that way. And again, at the end point of this continuum is self-service where the provider completely goes away with technology, and you go back to the restaurant. Maybe you've been in a restaurant where you have a tablet display on the table, and you literally order your food by interacting with the tablet, and then the waiter or server brings the food that you've already ordered without any interaction with the person at all. I don't want to imply that self-service is some kind of best outcome of technology enhancement, because in fact we can all imagine places where self-service has gone too far. I had the misfortune of going to try to buy some things at Home Depot not long ago, and I was just overwhelmed by how hard it was to use their self-service checkout system, where you've got this pen where you put the goods. You have to learn how to punch in the goods that are not particularly well described sometimes, that they don't have particular specialized tags on them, like you're buying a pile of things. You've got to figure out how to pay for things. You've got to figure out how to bag things. It's kind of the number of bags you have, and if you have to pay for the bag in some cities, it has to charge you for the bags, and it's just way too much. In fact, I think they know that too, because there's always a person looking in the corner to help you figure out the self-service, because it's too hard for you to do without them. All right, that's the second pattern, this technology enhancement pattern of person-to-person interactions. A third pattern for service design is the service intensity pattern, which again looks at person-to-person services, maybe with the assumption that the more interactions you have with the service customer, the more desirable, the better quality of service. But I like to think of this more as a design parameter, and say you can look at possible service offerings of the same type or in the same industry as deviations in some space of intensity from a generic service that has some standard number of touch points, and we can add or subtract touch points to increase or decrease the service intensity. So consider how hotels, restaurants, department stores, airlines might have different kinds of service levels where they target them to different people according to the extent of personal service interaction willing to pay for it. So you have, first class where they pamper you when they have coach where they don't, or they have, the priority lanes or the priority kind of treatments that you have, the reserved dining room, that kind of thing, where you have different kinds of service offerings based on how much you're willing to pay the service provider. So let's look at a pattern like this, a generic hotel. In a generic hotel, you find out the hotel exists, you make a reservation, you go to the hotel, you check in, you sleep, eat, rest, take a shower, maybe eat some food, room service perhaps, and then you eat breakfast and you check out. But that's that's a typical hotel. You can easily imagine the budget hotel that has very few interactions, where we simply replace some of those with nothing. You find the hotel, you go there, you pay, you sleep, you wash up, take a shower, and you leave the next morning, maybe after having breakfast. Very simple interaction, a lot less expensive, obviously, a lot less need for trained service personnel to provide that level of service. Of course, the other extreme, we have the very fancy hotel, the Ritz-Carlton, the Four Seasons, the whatever you have, the big resort hotel that has many, many more touch points and more interaction. You don't have to be able to read this. You might study it later. But you see there's more boxes, there's more circles, because we're now doing more things. We're able to, you get to the hotel, they park your car, they bring your bag to your room, they walk you up to the room and teach you how to use all the nice toys in the room, the power blinds, the TV set, the different kinds of appliances you might have in the room. They may take you a tour of the property to show you where the golf course is, or the spas, or so on, and so on and so on. And then you can use those services. So again, there's more interactions, requires much more service personnel, much more service training, and so on to use them. What we're really doing, though, we're just saying there was a generic hotel, and we can add or subtract interactions to increase the intensity. Again, subject to the fact that people will have preferences, and some people may prefer the stripped-down hotel because all they want to do is sleep and get out. And finally, we have this pattern. It's the more complicated pattern, but I think it's the most interesting pattern because it's really the most generative, and that is that we can look at services in terms of the relative and absolute amount of three kinds of interactions. If this box in this picture represents the value being created in a service, we see three kinds of things that create the value. We have physical manipulation, where you interact with some physical resource to create value. We have interpersonal relationships, where we interact with a person through some kind of interpersonal or empathetic engagement with them. to create value. And then we have symbolic manipulation, where we interact through information exchange as a way to create value. This is a work done by Apte and Mason a long time ago, which is still extremely relevant. Their goal at the time was to understand different kinds of occupations and how they might be able to be disaggregated. A fancy word that means taken apart, to provide outsourcing, so that you can have services like call centers in other countries rather than having to be in the building where the service would otherwise be provided. Here they analyze different kinds of occupations, and they essentially are saying, well, an accountant or actuary is very high in information but very low on interpersonal need or physical presence need. A cleaning service has to be physically present, doesn't have to interact with you as a person or as information exchange. A nurse requires highly engaged interaction on both physical, interpersonal, and information dimensions. We can depict this in kind of a 3D space, not to imply that there's a fixed location. You can think of this maybe as the generic pattern for this kind of job. Again, and subject to the last pattern, we could add more or fewer interactions. We can make it an intensive care nurse that would have even more interpersonal interaction, even more information exchange. We could have it be a nurse in a nursing home who does a lot less of that kind of interaction. But nonetheless, we might have these regions which characterize different kinds of occupations. And when we analyze different kinds of value creation patterns, we see that with digital information and digital resources, you don't really have to be there physically to interact with the stuff, and you don't have to talk to people when you interact with the stuff, because the essence of value creation is basically moving information around in some way or computing on some information. And so this is why companies are able to automate or self-serve or outsource to replace interactions that used to involve people and physical resources with these symbolic information exchange interactions. And that is a very kind of common design pattern to move in that direction of disaggregating these symbolic interactions from the other impacts, other dimensions. Now, in fact, it's not just pulling apart the symbolic stuff from the interpersonal and physical stuff. Information can also change the character of those interactions and physical interactions. So we can even replace them. So for example, if I use a telerobotic system or a telepresence system, I can be there without really being there. I can interact and do robotic surgery. I can do all kinds of telemedicine without having to be there, because I'm using information exchange to replace the need to be physically present or the need to physically interact with the patient or the other people in the conference room. And that's a really interesting trend that I think is going to slow down. We're going to see progressively increasing amounts of this kind of disaggregation where we can create value without having to be there, without having to interact with people at all through information exchange. Well, let me summarize. We've now looked at 4 design patterns: the front stage design pattern, front page, backstage, the person-to-person to self-service pattern, the service intensity pattern, and now this value creation pattern of Apte and Mason. And I hope that they've convinced you that you could be more innovative and successful as a designer if you employ these kinds of patterns, because they help you see the problem better and help you see what good solutions might be and help you make the trade-offs needed to make sure your system is optimal by highlighting the dimensions on which those trade-offs should be made. And with that, we're done. Thanks very much.